can hear that from here. I mean, it's
doing it. We're live. Hey, everybody. Okay. Brett, you're on your computer.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
I'm in charge. I just
Okay.
look at my computer.
Okay. All right. So, well, Jake has told us that we're live. So,
welcome to episode 5 of BEERMKR Office Hours. For those of you who haven't tuned in before, this is where we deep dive into a subject, answer questions you guys might have, and today we are covering all things taps, kegs, and bottles. So basically everything after the beer making process. First off, my name is Brett.
I'm Aaron. I'm Matt.
We are founding team of BEERMKR. What you drinking?
This is a Jurassic Ale that is looking very nice, crispy, smooth, everything you would hope on it. What are you drinking?
I don't know. It's Go Sweet.
Oh,
that was a test Ghost Wheat with Tetnang hops. I think I'm drinking the same thing.
Probably.
But yeah, we did a bunch of test annotations, so we always had extra test beer.
Yeah.
So, like I said, today we are covering taps, kegs, bottling, all of the above. For folks with questions, because I think this is going to be a lot of questions, this one, we're going to start with beer tap, we're going to go to beer keg, and then kind of work through all the other options. So, if you have a question about the keg, maybe wait until the keg section so your question doesn't get lost in the chat. First, let's jump into beer tap. So, this is still our recommended way to go. We know there's been a lot of problems, and we're going to be pretty upfront about them right now. Some of these problems are completely our fault. Matt has made a ton of changes to this thing over the last year or so. But some of the problems aren't entirely our fault. Maybe bad instructions, but like there's some little issues that we're always working on. So we're gonna troubleshoot a bunch of stuff right now. But this is also like the tap is, at least for me, it can be a little intimidating because if you've ever had an issue with your beer tap, you just get a little bit scared. You're dealing with pressure. You're at the end of a whole brew, and so the last thing you ever want to do is ruin, spill, explode your beer after you've already waited 2 weeks. So, first off, we've made a lot of changes to this thing, like I said. So, Matt, walk us through some of the changes you've made to the tap since we launched.
All right. One of the biggest and most important that a lot of people have emailed customer service and mixed up or had some problem with are the valves. So there are 2 types of gray valves currently. There's ones with red gaskets and there's ones with black gaskets. Do not use the black gasket ones in the beer tap. You will get a leak. You will definitely get a CO2 leak, if not a beer leak. The black gaskets don't work, and the plastic on those valves are different.
So, you can't just swap the gasket, the black gasket for the red gasket, and the red gasket for the black gasket.
Right. You cannot do that.
Okay.
In addition to that, if you have an older beer tap and you haven't gotten replacement valves from us, you need them. So what we originally happened was all of the valves were the same when we initially sent them out. Then we found out that it's not possible for everybody to tighten them the same way that we do in our off shop because we tighten them very hard.
Matt has man hands.
Basically,
designed them to be tightened very, very tight.
Big rock climbers.
Yeah.
we had rock climbers test them. It was probably a mistake. One way to tell if you have the wrong ones is you will probably have a very small line along the circumference under the red gasket.
So there's just a tiny bevel line underneath this gasket.
Yes.
Can we get a close up of this?
Yeah, someone
Jake?
No, here. So you can slide that thing up here.
Yeah.
show the thing. In
Yeah.
addition to that, you have a flat, completely. You have to show like sort of edge. In addition to that, the surface is completely flat. If there's like a rounded corner along that rim, that means you have the old one. The old ones can be used in the BEERMKR. Even with the red gaskets, it's still okay to use them. None of those can be used in the beer tap. They have to be the right plastic, and you have to use the red gasket. We are working on updating these. As a sort of tangent to that, there's been some talk about problems with the valves in general because the buttons break on them. Is it right if I go a little tangent?
Yeah,
Tangent.
roll. This is why we're here.
Yeah, I saw something in the blog about that today.
Yeah, so there's been a bunch of talk about it. We are working on updating the valves. It's not a simple process. People have in the past recommended we make the button metal. That is not possible to do. You can't make the geometry that we're trying to do on the button to have all the features the button has, the spring release and all of that, and have it be metal at the same time.
Why is that, Matt?
It just, you can't machine it. It would make the valves way more expensive even if we could, and you just can't machine that geometry any way that makes sense.
Also, you can't really install it because
that's the other
you have
thing.
to push through and bend the button a little bit as you shove the button through the piston.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of people out there do hard cleans of their valve, which is great. You probably have noticed that when you're uninstalling and reinstalling the button, you have to be careful and you have to push it in just right so that it doesn't bend. But it needs to bend a little bit, but not a lot. If it bends too much, you're going to warp the button and you possibly break it. If it bends too little, you're not going to be able to get it over. It's just a very fine balance between all of the geometries in there. We are working on updating that, and it's a material change that we're testing right now. We just haven't gotten them made. And almost all of these valves have been from the same batch.
So, material, isn't it just plastic?
No. Most of the valve is polypropylene because it's high temperature food grade. The button itself is polycarbonate because it's a food grade polycarbonate. Partially it doesn't really touch any food because the button actually doesn't interact with any of the fluid. Also it's stronger, less likely to warp, which was a problem we had on an initial batch of valves when we made them out of polypropylene. So we made them out of polycarbonate, but polycarbonate is more brittle. So now we're working on using a polycarbonate
ABS.
It's either polycarbonate ABS or polycarbonate polypropylene blend. It's got like a small amount of the non-polycarbonate in there, but it makes it less or more crack resistant and less brittle. So that's what we're working on right now, but there's other changes that we're making on the valves. But
All right, let's talk about valves for like 45 more minutes.
Yeah.
But
we can talk about it for
I do have a very specific valve question. So we said you can't put the black valve in the tap to brew because you'll probably leak gas and or beer.
Yes.
Can you use your red valve in your machine?
You can. You don't need to, but you can. It doesn't. It's not going to cause any
This is
problems.
from a gentleman who's gotten rid of his tap. Someone bought it, but
Yeah.
he'd given up.
It'll be pointing the wrong direction.
It'll be because it's about 1 or 2 millimeters shorter. The shoulder is. It may be pointing more sideways than front. It's hard to say. It should work. We modified the waste bags recently, so they have the same geometry as the little the little gray caps that are inside the beer tap that are attached to the tubes. So they replicate the waste bag so that everything will seal, it'll work fine. It's just, it won't necessarily be facing what quite looks like the right direction, but it should have no problem sealing.
So we had a question too is, what do they do if they think they have an old red valve?
Email support.
Email customer support, we'll get you replacement.
Yeah, we'll walk you through to make sure you do in fact have an old one, and then if you do, we'll get you new ones.
In fact, if you have any questions on if you don't have the most up-to-date anything, email support. We have some stock questions that we will ask you to get some pictures of your machine or your beer tap. Beer tap's the thing that has any changes actually. And then we'll be able to diagnose any issue.
Can we do a quick, what are the telltale signs of an old beer tap?
Sure. This one is not an old beer tap, but I can show you on it what has changed.
You have old beer taps right here.
Yeah, we can grab one of those.
This one?
That can be a little confusing, but let's just see.
I can just stay on this one. So, can you see me? Oh,
Yeah,
good enough for-
just
okay.
leave it for-
So on this side, on the black inner shell side, that hole that's on there, if it's small, if it doesn't look about this size, that means it hasn't been drilled out. That was one modification that we had to make after the fact, was we had to drill out those holes to a certain size because there was some variation that was not initially seen by us in the geometry of the CO2 cartridges. The initial supplier we had didn't tell us that there was any variation in the geometry. This neck right here on the drawing is a specific size. In practice, it can be that shape or it can be that shape. If it's the second shape, it will run into the plastic and cause it to leak unless you screw it down really, really hard. We don't have any control over those, so we had to modify the plastic itself. So that's the first thing. The second thing we did was the tubing that comes from the regulator. We replaced it with a different setup for it. Initially, it was the same basically the same tubing as the dispensing line. What we did instead was we made it have a smaller diameter, and then we have to sort of heat apply them to all of the barbs. And there's still one clip on it, but we removed the rest of the clips. So if you have any white clips other than the one around the gray cap right here, then you have an old line, and to contact customer service, we can give you a new line. We can figure out a way to get it replaced. It's not a difficult change to make. Another thing that happened was, you don't have to worry about it.
Okay.
It's just this line. It's the line coming from the regulator, not the line leaving the bag.
The regulator, by the way, for those of you who are not engineers, is where the CO2 actually plugs into. It's on this gray side here, and that just manages the pressure that comes out of your CO2 cartridge.
Yes. one other thing that I found, it wasn't something that...
Those are the kind of questions you should definitely ask in the chat.
Yes. One of the things that I found, it wasn't something we did, or something our manufacturer did. We changed some of the geometry of this gray cap that screws onto the gray valve. Somehow, in one of the batches that they made, they had some of our old ones sitting around, and they used those. If you have one of those, you will have a beer leak. So if you have ever had a beer leak in your beer tap, that is one thing that is a possibility. I'm not going to try to get this up there in front of there, but there is this bump, this sort of nub that goes around this face inside here. It presses against the seal. If you don't have one of those in there, you have an old version of that, we can get it fixed. Just email customer support.
Basically, I think the overall theme here is if you're concerned your pieces aren't the right pieces, customer support.
Yep.
We'll figure it all out. So let's
Well, there's one last change so people know. The last thing that they
Alright,
get for a change is
check.
we switched the side that the dispensing line is coming from,
Aha.
so that both the dispensing and regulator lines are both on the same side. There
You
doesn't
mean
nec-
this side.
yeah, on this side. So there would be no tubes coming out of the side with the black inner shell. That doesn't necessarily mean you have an old one. We switched that while we were doing fixes. If you want, we can make a change for that. It's not going to cause any problems. It just makes it a little bit easier for you not to clamp lines in it when you're closing it.
So I want to take a second because as the non-engineer in the room, I found that getting a better understanding of how the tap actually works from an overall standpoint helps you troubleshoot. So say you do have a little gas leak or something like that when you're tapping, or you forget to screw the CO2 all the way in, you can troubleshoot quickly and not lose your beer. Because that's the worst thing in the world, is that you ditch your whole beer. So let's take this thing. Matt, when you look at the beer tap from the inside, we're setting the top valve in here like so. Which side is the CO2 coming from and which side is the beer coming out of?
CO2 is coming in this side, beer is coming out that side.
So your CO2 is being forced into your top valve of the bag, and your beer is coming out of the bottom bag.
Yes.
Or the bottom valve.
And one thing to help you with orientation is, so there's a handle on the bag. You want that lined up with the text on the gray inner shell that says top valve. It's got an arrow pointing to where the top valve is, but it lets you know that if you have your handle where it says top valve, you've got everything positioned right.
Okay, so as far as attaching valves, we've talked about it being a little hard. What are some best practices for attaching your gray valves?
For attaching your gray valves, my recommended way to do it is with a paper towel of some sort.
Yeah.
You can,
This is a prop, so
Okay.
we're not there yet for my prop.
first. Okay, so what I would do is I would take a paper towel that may magically appear. Maybe not.
It's over here.
Do we have
Oh.
paper towels?
It's fine. What
So
I
before doing that, by the way, this is why I brought this over. So this is Start Sand, and we have them in spray bottles. They're available in the store. This is how I do all of my gray valve installs. I'll take some Star Sand, get your bottle going, and I'll spray the inside of the cap. In the instructions, we recommend doing a wipe down with alcohol wipes, which you absolutely can do. But what I love doing is spraying the top, and then I'll just fill the gray valve with Star Sand, just like that. And then when I screw the cap in, this excess Star Sand will fill the void, and because there can be a little bit of air that gets caught in this valve, and Star Sand is flavorless. It's just very low pH. So you won't even notice the difference when you put Star Sand directly into your beer. You can drink it. You won't even be able to taste the stuff. But filling the valve void with star sand will sanitize it, and it will remove all of the oxygen when you plug it in. So, pro tip.
So one thing that I use the paper towel for is these little bumps that we put on here were for grip, but I found people have trouble gripping onto it because they're kind of close together. We're updating those in the next version of this part, but as of right now, all of the ones everyone has, all the ones that we currently have are like this. So I usually like to put a towel on it to give me better grip, and then I will just use the front of the valve as sort of a lever, and I use that to twist it on just a little bit tighter so I can get it on nice and tight.
Is there anything you can look for to make sure that you're not having an issue at this point?
You want to make sure that you don't see any of the red gasket poking out. You really shouldn't.
So yeah, right here, this line, you can, if you haven't tightened it down enough, you can see a little bit of red gasket, or if you've burped it, and you can see maybe some gasket sticking out just right here. And if you see that, unscrew it, stick the gasket back in there, screw it and tighten it up.
Yeah. And you want to do that on both sides. So you want to grab another valve.
So yeah, so as you're tightening those in, step one is like really focus on getting them super tight, making sure that that red gasket isn't poking out at all.
Yeah. So yeah, and then you do it on both sides. I mean, we're not filling this with fluid right now, so I'm just going to do it by hand. But yeah.
So go ahead and connect
Are we
those.
going to plug them in?
Yeah,
So,
we're gonna pretend
so
like
actually,
we're-
there's a trick to plugging them in without having any spill also.
What's that?
So what you want to do is you want to get them connected without attaching them, without pushing them. You want to get them centered with one another so that they're lined up, and then you want to all at once just push to click them together. Just one straight push between the two of them once they're lined up, and then you won't have any small spill when you're attaching them.
Yeah, I like to twist it a little bit to make sure that the valve is seated right, and you can feel it because they're both circular. Once you twist them, they'll seat themselves, and then you just smash it together.
Twist them before you attach them. Do not twist them after you attach them. If you twist them after you attach them, you could loosen the white valve, and that could cause leaks.
All right, so this is a lot of stuff, right? And I think this is probably a good time to transition to say, like, this was complicated, right? And for the very first time that people were getting to know the machine, getting to know the tap, this was a challenge for a lot of people. So are we ready to transition into the next steps?
Of this process?
No, the next process.
I thought we wanted to brag about this.
No.
We're gonna
So I want to do a
brag
couple
about
more.
this,
I want to do a couple. Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about.
All right, no, no.
I wanted to make sure we're troubleshooting start
Yeah.
to finish here.
Gotcha.
So we just troubleshooted how to
Okay.
make sure you're screwing these things in right.
Okay.
So you're closing your machine right.
There's one other thing you want to check before you close it, because I've noticed this happen to a couple people recently, and it's something that is not necessarily something that you did. It's something that could have just accidentally happened when you were using it before. There is a black O-ring inside of the regulator. When you look down, there should be a little black circle around the pin that pierces the CO2. If you do not see a little black ring inside of that, it will not seal. It'll just spray out CO2, and it'll just be mess. It won't cause a mess. You won't have any carbonation whatsoever.
It's right
Right
in
in
here. Right, that little thing.
Okay.
Zoom in? Okay.
So all right. So now we've connected our valves, closing the tab, locking it up.
Well, while we're doing that, we might want to keep one thing in mind. Especially
look for
make sure that
pinches.
yeah. So you're gonna want to make sure as you're closing it, especially. No, you want to make sure as you close it, especially if your lines are coming from the other side, that none of the lines are on this lip. So just make sure they're all tucked down or tucked away, and make sure that nothing's getting clamped, because that's happened to a couple people, and it's a difficult thing to deal with if it happens. You're not dead in the water if it does. It's not going to blow up or anything. It's not going to leak. It's just going to not pour beer, and you're going to have to do a couple extra steps.
So to make sure nothing is pinched before you put the CO2 in, because putting in your CO2 is kind of like the point of no return. Even just with gravity, kind of open up your beer tap, and you should get a little bit of drip of beer. So if that is working, if you can pull beer out of your beer tap, that means you're ready to put in CO2. You don't have any pinches. So that's the last thing you want to do before you actually screw in your CO2 cartridge. So then, now you're going to screw in your CO2 cartridge, and some checks you can do here, right? So you screwed it in, you hear that like puncture sound, you hear some air. We're going to go for it?
That's good.
Sure.
Do live.
So you stand at this direction. This is how I do it. You don't have to do it this way.
They can't see you.
You don't have to do it this way. but I generally do it where I have it stand up. When I screw it in, I pull up on it a little bit to make sure it's sort of seated. It helps making sure the threads are all engaged. I keep doing this until I feel that it's sort of bottomed out and it's not going to screw anymore. And then I do a couple big ones like that. And once I start hearing it pierce a little bit and push, I still screw it a couple more times.
So that's an especially long squeal because it's filling up the entire bag of CO2, not just that tiny void.
Yeah.
But so at this point, you've engaged your CO2 cartridge. You're not blasting everywhere. It's a long squeal. But bring it back. So, but this before you stick it in your fridge, this is where you want to double check that you're not getting any air leaks or any liquid leaks. So I've often just put a paper towel under right here in the crack because if any beer comes out, it's going to leak right through this crack and you can just visibly see. You can also listen up here because this is where your CO2 is coming into that top valve that we talked about earlier. So you can kind of listen, and if you're getting an air leak, you can usually hear it. So before you just pop this thing in your fridge, you kind of want to like give it a minute to make sure everything's good. And if you're getting a leak of liquid or beer or air or anything,
if you hear that squeal continue, you know you've got a leak in there. Because
and the thing is like your beer's not gone. You haven't. It's only gone if you stick it in your fridge and you wake up the next morning and it's all on the floor.
Yeah.
So what you want to do if you're getting any sort of air leak or any sort of liquid leak, follow these steps.
So what I would do is I'd flip it over.
Why do you flip it over?
You flip it over because if you don't, you're going to be spraying beer everywhere. Whereas if you flip it over right now, that means the gas that's in it is at the top, right next to the valve. So when you release it, all you're releasing is gas. So if it's starting to leak or anything, just
Did you take out your CO2 first?
nope, you can do this. You can take out your CO2, but it's probably easier to let all the gas out first because there will still be some pressure in the cartridge. So if you don't let all the gas out, it's kind of hard to unscrew it sometimes, and it can ice over really fast.
If your cartridge ices over, like if it's spraying and it basically just builds up a lot of condensation that freezes immediately, that means it's not sealed properly, and all that air is coming out.
Right. So one thing to note is that there's a couple safety features on here that are sort of built in. One, you can't actually open the beer tap with a CO2 cartridge in. So this acts sort of as a pin to keep this thing from opening. Another thing is if this thing does pop open, like if you start to open it, it has a latching. It has a latching. Well, there's no CO2 in it. It has a latching feature. So if it starts to pop open, it'll catch itself on the actual valve
like that.
when there's pressure.
Yeah.
Right
It'll
now.
pop, and it's happened a lot of times to us.
Yeah. If you happen to do that, it will fail safe. Don't have to worry about that. So.
All right, so we've walked through all the troubleshooting steps. The tap is still our preferred way to go. It is still our baby. So for that, I'm going to give the floor to Aaron to make his case for the beer tap. Because we're well aware that a lot of people ditch the beer tap. The second you lose one beer, it's the worst.
Yeah.
It's a mess. We totally get it.
Yeah.
So with that, Aaron,
All
make
right.
the case for the tap.
Beer tap. The reason we made this system to begin with was because it was a hand and glove fit of take your beer, and when you're done with the beer, you are moving it directly into a safety environment. You're not exposing it to oxygen or bacteria or all of the things which are the things that can ruin your beer. So the wonderful thing about the beer tap is it allows you to keep the beer in the same environment that it was brewed in, which is sanitary and free of oxygen. So we've gone through great lengths in designing the machine with the bags that have the vibration motor on the bottom to clear the bags from sediment that will allow this to happen. And the result is when the beer tap works, beer that is phenomenal. Like you do not have defects, you don't have oxygen, you don't have bacteria. So the beer tap is great. It keeps the beer fresh for a very long time, so long as you keep your CO2 on it and there aren't leaks or anything like that. You know, it's going to keep the beer great for months.
Would
in
you
your
say
fridge.
it's the fastest method of carbonating?
100%.
would you say it gets the most beer out of a beer bag?
Absolutely.
Oh, man, what else?
And it's because we designed it to do that.
Good God.
Yeah, who would have thought? So, yeah, so then the reason why it carbonates quickly is because when the bag expands, you get more exposure of CO2 to surface area inside your beer. If you are bottling your beer, you have to wait a couple weeks for the yeast to eat the extra bottling sugar that you've put into your beer and then allow it to carbonate naturally. Likewise, if you're using other kegs and devices, then the surface area is much smaller because you don't have that expansion that you get within the bag, which is so nice. So really the beer tap is the purest way to get excellent beer. And when things are working properly, which, you know, it took us easily 6 months to really flesh that process out for everybody. So thank you, every person who's gone through this process with us. Mostly it was winter, spring to early summer of 2021, where we were going through all of these changes with the beer tap. So thank you so much for your patience and your participation in this. But from summer 2021 onwards, the beer tap has been pretty solid when it comes to functionality, and it's my preferred way to store beer. And the only challenge is sometimes it doesn't fit in my fridge. So
Nice. Good question from Mr. Bruce. Is there a good way to keep your beer from overcarbonating when adding the second cartridge?
yes, so the first thing to do would be to
Drink your beer faster.
well,
Bruce.
yeah, right, yeah, come on, Bruce. So don't overconsume. If you were to drink your beer and let's say you're at about 6 beers out of your tap, what often happens is you see it slow down. It's no longer pouring as quickly. Possibly you're losing a little bit of carbonation. Maybe you went on vacation, you come back and you're like, oh, I've lost some pressure. So you screw in that second cartridge. And what Bruce is talking about is sometimes when you screw that second cartridge in, it over foams. So what you can do when that happens is just unscrew that CO2 cartridge and you let it, once you start hearing it hiss in the, with the CO2 being released, just walk away, you're done. The next beer you pour will have a little bit of overcarbonation, but the rest of it will be totally fine.
So you're saying just get that initial burst of pressure from the CO2 cartridge and then pull it out.
That's right.
So you don't need a full cartridge, you just need to basically fill that void again and
That's it.
that should get you to the end.
Yeah, and the reason is your beer's already carbonated.
Alright, cool. Yeah, that's a good point. Alright, so we're gonna move on. I know that was titillating to talk about valves and gaskets and all of the above.
Do you have any specific questions?
Yeah, we'll do questions at the end. You can also hit us up with questions right now. Yeah, anything in the chat. So now we're gonna move on to the Beer Keg. So this is something that we launched recently with the buddies over at Growlerworks. This is technically a U-Keg Go. They've also got they've got another, both of these are 128 ounces. They have a U-Keg that has a bit more of a variable pressure thing on top. But this is just a really simple way to pull your beer from your beer bag, put it in here, pressurize and go. So, let's see, where do we start? Talk to me about cleaning, because that's really the key to anything. The second you take the beer out of the beer maker, the key is cleaning.
Right, so
let's talk
the
about it.
difference between this and let's call it the beer tap is the beer tap is already clean. Because the tap itself is just 2 connections and a place to hold the pressure inside the bag, and your bag is clean, so you don't have to worry about cleaning. You just a little alcohol wipe and clean your valves, and that's fine. The beer keg, however, oh, that's nice. So this is an entirely stainless interior, which needs to get cleaned and sanitized. So the best way to clean this is using PBW. We have that in the store. So you drop a couple of PBW tablets in here, fill it up with hot water, let it sit, and then that will dissolve all of the beer gunk that is inside the beer keg or the U-Keg Go. And then you have to sanitize it as well before you put your beer in, because we need to get all of the bacteria, wild yeast, and whatnot that's floating around that will inevitably get inside there. So that is a consideration when using these things.
In terms of instructions on how to fill this up, we've got video for the bottle filling wand that applies here. You can also use the bottle filling video. Kind of gives you an overview of how to use this. We're going to put together a video specifically around the beer keg in the next 2 days or something like that. So we'll get something out this week. But let's see. What talk to us about CO2 cartridges.
All right. So, UKEG, in their instructions, do mention that they would like you to use an unthreaded cartridge. It looks like this. There's no threads on the cartridge. They recommend that. I've been in contact with their technical team to figure out why that is, and it pretty much is that a lot of the threaded ones aren't food safe, and they've seen people have issues with them because they're just kind of random ones that people get. Ours are good, and they'll work with the system. So
to be fair, when Matt says ours are good, it's because we source CO2 cartridges that are already food and beverage grade CO2. So every cartridge that you receive with maker kits has beverage grade CO2 in here. And what that means is the interior, the exterior, everything has been sanitarily cleaned and removed of oil. So if you were to go to your local bike shop and buy some of these CO2 chargers for your bike tires, they're going to be covered in oil. They're going to be disgusting. And if you've ever smelled what it's like after you filled a bike tire with one of these, not one of these, but one that you buy from a bike shop, it's pretty gross. Whereas these are specifically designed for beverages. So if you use one of the BEERMKR branded, or just really
Whatever
the
comes with
CO2
kits,
comes
yeah.
with a maker kit, you're fine.
Yeah. The only thing, if you want to be extra cautious with it, is you can take some thread tape and wrap it around, or some of the nylon, Teflon tape, wrap it around the threads just to make them a little bit less sharp when they get screwed in there. It should not cause a problem based off of the sizes and everything that need to get used in there. But if you want to be extra careful, it doesn't hurt to do that.
So I've been using one of these UKEGs for about 6 months now. I found that it takes a little bit longer to carbonate because you've got less surface area. You're just kind of hitting this little neck of beer up at the top of the keg. So maybe it takes 2 days to get a full carbonation. But otherwise it's pretty easy. And I've also been using threaded the entire time and haven't had an issue. But there's a chance that my little gasket in here is getting chewed up a bit by those threads.
Yeah, and it's a off-the-shelf O-ring that we can use that
We'll get
it's
more.
not hard to
Yeah.
replace.
I'll give one suggestion. I mean, like, cleaning is cleaning, right? Cleaning and sanitizing is its own kind of labor-intensive process. But one thing I will recommend too is once your UKEG is filled with beer, there's going to be a little space with oxygen present. So to try to avoid as much oxidation as possible, you can do a little bit of a purge, right? And so what you do is you screw in this top, open up the CO2, and you're going to hear it make some noise. It'll make less noise when it's full of beer. But basically, maybe 2 or 3 times, just keep doing that repeatedly. So what that's doing is forcing in carbon or CO2 into that space, and you're letting it escape. So you just want to do that a few times to try to make sure that little bit of void space in your UKEG is full of CO2 and not oxygen.
And it's also important to note that before you fill your UKEG, you should do this as well. So before you fill it, you should purge it, and then use your bottle filler, keg filler, which we covered on the last office hours. Pretty sure those are the last office hours. And then that way, when you're filling your UKEG, it will be just a layer of CO2 on the bottom and not oxygen that is whipping around inside the keg.
I'm going to just quickly link the bottle filling videos that we've made so far
Okay.
in the chat. So this is relatively straightforward in terms of use. Like I said, your biggest concerns here are cleaning, sanitizing, and oxidation. So if you thoroughly clean, thoroughly sanitize, do some of these steps to make sure you're not oxidizing your beer, then you should be in good shape. So I'm gonna make the case for the Beer Keg now. So I've been using this for about 6 months, and I actually am a really big fan. I do most of my brewing here in the office. Those are my machines right there. And so what I love about this is it's portable, right? So I'm pulling only the cleanest beer right off the top of my bag, putting it in here, carbonate it, and I bring it home on the weekend and enjoy it. Downsides, I'm getting less beer. I'm only getting 128 ounces. I'm probably losing 2 beers.
Probably about
Year
2
and a
years,
half.
yeah.
For the most part, but it's super easy. I find it kind of fun. It's something you can bring to a friend's house. You can bring it out to the park. You can bring it. Well, depends where you live. But yeah, no. So I've been a fan of the UKEG. I've been pushing for this. So in general, yeah, I've just kind of enjoyed it. It just makes the whole process a little bit more mobile, a little more friendly, a little more social. And that's kind of the point of beer, right?
Yep.
Hanging out. So
Exactly.
that's that. Beer kegs. I just put a bottling video in the chat. So then outside of that, now we're getting into kind of like, we launched a bottling kit recently. And that is the bottle filling tube plus all of the bottles, caps, cleaning, sugar tablets, everything you need.
Yep.
But that's really similar to anything else you might use. So it's just, I mean, this is a less interesting or at least less detailed subject to cover because it's just
Yeah.
like clean everything.
Yeah,
really
so
well.
exactly. So what I recommend doing before you get started on this, do we have a gray valve? So the gray valve screws in to this. You should recognize this from your beer taps. Here's a gray valve. So this just screws in like normal. And then you connect this to the top valve of your bag. So you disconnect the brew tub, plug this in, and then you can start filling your bottles. Very important to fill this whole thing up with sanitizer so you get the whole thing sanitized, and also spray down the outside of this as well to make sure that this piece, which is going to be touching every beer that you bottle or keg, will also be sanitized. Something to point out as well is there is a step down in tube size from here to here. What that means is you go from smaller volume to larger volume, and there can be a little bubble that forms right there. So all I do to get rid of that bubble is as I'm filling, you just pull this up, and then the bubble goes away. So just mess around with it. Make sure you don't have, a bubble that sits there and oxidizes your beer, and then otherwise you're pretty good to go.
All right, so we're starting to run out of things to talk about.
I had a couple questions on support that people asked me to.
Yes, please.
Oh, all right.
Nice, good.
So let me make
Let's
sure
do it.
sure we covered them.
But this is like opening up the floor to everybody. Any questions?
This is
Tapping
questions
related,
time.
Beer maker related?
Yeah.
I don't know.
First question I
Whatever.
had from customer support was, I would be interested in hearing more about the use of Quebec in DIY and the choice for brewing. Also, if we're going to do any new 5-day IPA kits.
What a great
All right, question one. Let's talk
question.
about new kits.
Yeah.
How much can we give away?
How much do we want to give away? So we have a full schedule.
We have a very full summer and fall.
So
Pretty
expect
pumped up about
a new kit every couple of weeks. I think that's probably safe to say.
that. Yeah, and in terms of 5 days, that is definitely a line that we're going to expand. We started off with the wheat. We've got 2 or 3 more
So
coming
let's
over
back
the
it
next,
up. Stouts. We did 5 days. We did a
That's
lot
true,
of
we
5
did-
days
That's
stouts.
true. We did the February stouts. We're going to kind of tweak that recipe and get back to what is the perfect 5-day stout. But yeah, IPA is obvious.
Mhm.
We're getting there.
Very excited. We're playing with a 5-day hazy. I can say that.
5-day hazy.
5-day hazy is going to be
working on.
really fun. In particular, why I like the hazy of all for the 5-day is that style, more than any style in beer and brewing, is the most sensitive to oxidation and the most sensitive to fresh hops. So you want to drink that one as fast as possible, and having that one in particular in a 5-day format with the Quebec yeast, which produces very neutral, maybe just like a hint of pineapple flavors. It goes so well with hazy, juicy IPAs. So That's one I'm looking forward to. And then over the next, like 3 or 4 months, we're going to have another, 10 beers come out. So very excited about every last one of those because we're drinking them in the shop, and it's very promising.
Tastings aplenty.
Yes.
In general, I think our schedule for the rest of the summer is like every 2-ish weeks. So think about that.
Yeah.
As you buy your beers.
Yeah.
Maybe you wait a month and buy a bunch. So anyway,
And just to answer the other part of it, the Quebec yeast, there is a Quebec yeast profile in the DIY section. So if you want to set that up, you can set it up there.
And in general, for folks who are playing around, like I'm newer to brewing with this whole thing, so whenever I do experiments, I don't go dive completely into the DIY section. I'll run a Redwood IPA, or I'll run, if I'm doing Quebec IPA, so basically it's a yeast strain and dry hop step. Does it have it? So I'll run like the Backyard IPA, which is something we launched last summer, which was a Quebec IPA with a dry hop step. So you can kind of find a beer that's similar in terms of yeast profile and whether or not you dry hop, and then you can mess around and kind of do it yourself.
Yeah,
so.
and the reason it's important to choose your yeast profile is that really informs the entirety of the fermentation. So it informs the temperature, it will inform how long it stays at what temperature, and it will inform how fast the vibratory motor is running. Because certain yeast will flocculate, which means falling out of suspension.
Great word.
Sooner rather than later. So you got to have the vibe motor running to keep up with it.
We've got a question from Dr. Pete. So he broke one valve, but then he put the red gasket on a different valve, and now he's lost. Is there an easy way to tell which valve should be the red gasket valve? Is it that little bit of bevel right underneath the valve?
Yes, right under the sort of shoulder where the gasket sits.
So this is the shoulder, right here. That is the shoulder.
Put the valve on, or put the gasket on, otherwise you can't tell.
Just start the jig.
Jake.
There should be a little line under. It also will not have a rounded corner. There won't be a rounded corner along that edge. So that one right there is not the correct one.
But as you can see, there is
The correct
no...
one is in the beer tap that we put.
Oh, it's good. That's okay. But Dr. Pete, if you have other questions, you can also call, and we'll help. We can take a look at your valves and just kind of like point and pick which one.
Yes.
Kevin, I fill mini kegs, and then he throws a couple on. I do that too. Whenever I fill the beer keg, I tend to bottle 1 or 2 beers just for fun, and they just kind of sit. Some later date, I'll get back to them.
Exactly. So the reason is the U-Keg only holds 128 ounces, so you're leaving a beer or two in your beer maker. So if you just use the exact same thing and fill up a bottle or two, drop some priming sugar in it, now you've got your beer keg and then a couple bottles of beer.
So Bruce asked the same question I just kind of was saying, but like here's one thing I don't totally understand. So when you've got a beer bag of clean, delicious beer, and you're pulling off into your keg, is there if you want to naturally carbonate a bottle or two, you need yeast.
Yep.
Does the top of the bag, for example, have less yeast, active potential yeast than the bottom of the bag? So if you really wanted to carbonate this naturally, in theory, you could wait to the bottom or the middle or the top. Like, is there any difference? Does it matter?
Well, there shouldn't be much of a difference if the whole volume of the bag is clear, clean beer like this or like that. You should have a pretty uniform distribution of yeast that are still just sitting around. That said, you don't want to be bottling sediment either.
Well, that's the question, is like what I'm bottling towards the end where your bag empties out, you're starting to kind of like get some flow across the back, you're picking up sediment. Is that active yeast, or is that just sediment that...
Honestly, that's usually dead yeast.
Alright, so if anything, you want to put that in your keg to settle than the bottle. So if you just do 2 bottles off the top, fill your keg. That's
totally
ratio.
fine. That's totally fine, yeah.
There you go.
And sort of jumping off of some of these questions, another customer support question. Please talk about carbonation with bottling sugar versus CO2, both for bottles and mini kegging. Pros and cons.
Okay, so the biggest pro is that you don't have to use CO2 cartridges. You don't have to use CO2, for your bottles in particular. The process is called natural carbonation or re-fermentation.
You made a video, right?
And you're able to, what's that?
Science is out there.
Yeah, science. Yeah. So you're able, and what's really nice about
Link it, Jake.
it as well is you're able to alter the amount of sugar you're adding to each bottle or to your mini keg, and you're able to really fine tune what your dissolved CO2 rate or volumes of CO2. Different beer styles will have different vols recommended. So a stout porter, usually 1.8 to 2 vols of CO2 dissolved is the ideal, and you can match that by putting sugar in. Same deal with your, let's call it pale ales, IPAs, 2.5, 2.6, and you can add a little more sugar so that you can carbonate up to that correct vol. You can do the same with the big regulator with a gauge, and you can dial it in, and so that's a whole draft. Let's call it draft configuration step that you can do when you're using sugar that you can't do in a beer tap or in a UK Go, because the regulators here are pretty basic that we're using in both of these.
What are they set to?
Ours is set to 12 psi, which is about 2.5 vols. UK Go, honestly, I'm not sure.
The Go has 2 settings, which
Yeah.
is like, at least I use it as Go. Oh, it's got CO2 in it, so oh, this one has beer in it. I almost blasted myself.
Can leave it up here. I need another beer.
I just use the full carbonate to kind of to carbonate your beer, and then the next, if it's already kind of fully carbonated, you can just turn it down so your flow's not so.
Yep. And something to note for people who have done the regulator modification on their beer tap, be careful with that. We designed it to be within a certain pressure range. I would not recommend you bumping it up to 30 psi to carbonate with. I would stay in the teens, low teens, maybe max is
this
17.
is probably a good
Other than that,
comparison.
yeah.
One of the not honestly downsides of bottling is you don't really know what's going on, and you just wait and you hope it works.
True.
And I just like every time I think of bottling, I just think of that scene in Breaking Bad where what's his face is Schrader, whatever his name is.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, all his bottles are blowing up in the garage because he was brewing beer, and it's like if something goes wrong, you're not gonna know until you pop it open, right? If you don't put enough sugar in, open it, it's not carbonated, or if it gets contaminated, you won't know until you sip it. So it's just a bigger investment for a little bit more of a questionable outcome.
Yeah. So, and this is a good point too. Like the Imperial Stout that we had out in February, I bottled it, and I used the light carbonation, so I only used 3 of the little drops instead of 4 or 5, and it's too light. And now I've got 10 more bottles that like I don't really want to drink because I did too little carbonation.
I put one in 24 bottles, and they're still down there. What up, Wheezy? How do I keep the grain basket from leaking when I disconnect it to dump the grain?
What I like doing is you disconnect it, then reconnect it, disconnect it, reconnect it, and then that will get the piston moving, and that usually does it.
If that's what you're talking about. If you're talking about the grain basket.
That's not what he was talking about, but I think that's actually a really good point.
Yeah.
What I've been doing recently too is the second I disconnect that top valve, I hit it with a coffee cup real quick.
Yeah, that too.
But anyway, if you were asking about like just not making a mess when you pull out your old grains and you take them over to the sink, one thing. So what I do is first is I'll pull out the grain basket and I'll kind of sit it on the front of the brew tub, tuck the front latch. He's just like laughing at me because it's such a good description. I tuck the front latch into the brew basket, and so it kind of holds it in place and drains more, and then I just run for it. You can also flip over the top of the beer maker. You can wipe that clean, but if you just flip it over and put your brew basket in there and then run your chickens or whatever.
That's what we designed it to do.
Yep.
That's what we designed it to do.
Chicken.
Redwood IPA, best beer ever.
Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel.
I really like that beer. Like when you give it,
bottled right now. I've actually been enjoying it all weekend.
yeah, when you give it that 3 weeks to rest, like that beer is outrageously good.
Although based on sales, it's almost an even match between the Future and the Redwood. So If you want to push it over, you should buy some more Redwood. I'm just saying, you want to make sure that it's winning
That's
in the
hilarious.
sales. So.
But what is apparent is everybody likes IPAs.
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 Or they hate
You know.
them. There's a couple of people that absolutely hate it.
I know. No, we let that be too much of a guiding force, and we were like, all right, nobody wants IPA, so we'll just release a whole bunch of like the Meritzen or the Patio Pills or the Pumpkin or the Festivus or the Dunkelweizen, and then we had like 6 months of no IPAs. So that you can blame the IPA haters for that.
What all right, so it would be great if you expanded your Steam Hops lineup. That's not really a
It would be really great, and we're working on it. The latest one is Brewer's Gold. Very excited about that.
Do you have 5-minute Steam Hops?
No.
Sorry,
No. So 5-minute steam hops is tough because we want to make sure when it comes to the steaming process that we're actually hitting the times
Does
right.
5 minutes do anything?
It does, just a little bit.
Okay.
A little bit.
What you could do is you take some of the non-steam hops and some of the 10 minutes and just shake them up together and then throw it in there.
It doesn't work like that.
Perfect. It's exactly how it works.
Why is my beer? This is from Daniel. Why does it? He said he gets a lot of fermentation flavor, even in a cider.
Yeah.
This is a good question.
So what can happen depends on what you mean by fermentation flavor. Right.
Sometimes it can be a bit yeasty.
So if the question is yeasty, it's generally a flocculation problem. When you have beer in general, you ferment it out, the yeast are just kind of floating around in your beer. So you give them time at low temperatures and they'll settle out to the bottom of the bag. So if you look at Brett's beer, I'm going to pull this up in the light, super clear. There's not a lot of yeast in there. Whereas,
But then I shook the tap up a second ago.
and here's this one.
Because I thought it was empty.
Yeah, now we kicked up a lot of that sediment. So this is kind of what it looks like, have non-flocculated beer. This is protein break matter. This is dead yeast. This is live yeast. This is just sediment in general that got kicked up. This tastes better than this. So what we recommend doing is either giving it a little bit of time at cold temperatures or using clarifier.
So, I mean, I would highly recommend using the clarifier. It speeds that process up.
Yep.
But then also, once you do tap your beer and you leave it in your fridge, do everything you can in your power
Don't move
to
it.
just leave it. And
Don't
if you give
touch
that thing 2 days even, suddenly all of it will settle. That first beer you pull might be a little gross, just as like anything that's settled in the valve itself will kind of clear out. But then the next one will be very clear.
Yep.
Very delicious.
Yeah. But
Cooking ingredient. I don't know what that means.
I do want to do one final note to that, is that all yeast are different. That they're going to take different amounts of time to settle out. So one beer, like the Quebec beers, they settle out very quickly, whereas other beers like USO5 takes a really long time to settle out.
Do Quebec yeast achieve the same clarity?
Eventually, yes. Eventually, yes. All
Okay.
beers should eventually achieve the same clarity.
Unless they're hazy.
Right, and which is a different problem. It's not that your yeast are in there; it's that the protein structure of your grain bill and your hops that you put in there are causing
Thanks for
some.
All right. Well, I think we're kind of out of real questions. Kevin
Cool.
wants lagers.
Lagers,
Come on.
Kevin. We're doing one pretty soon.
I've
We're
got-
very excited about it.
Cool. News.
News.
I got a Mexican lager brewing. I got a Pils brewing. I'm going out of town for a while, so I was going to brew a bunch of nice summer beers, bottle them, leave them, come back, get after it. All right.
What else we got? We're done? Are we done?
Thus wraps up this episode of Office Hours. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
Yeah.
More questions, support at, follow us. God damn it.
All the things.
Hit the like and subscribe button. God,
Yes.
makes me want to throw up just saying that. But anyway, yeah, we're on the gram and the TikToks and the YouTubes and all the above. So follow, like, subscribe,
Yep.
etc., etc., etc.
We're really close to 1,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel.
Oh man, yeah, just
Yeah.
wait.
Tell your friends to come. I mean, just have them just watch 5 minutes of the video, just subscribe, and
Yeah,
just
exactly.
forget it. But we don't send a lot of notifications or anything, so
IPL, yeah. No, we've been seeing, who's it?
Ooh,
Wibby, who does
Wibby,
Wibby here in
yeah.
Colorado. They do really nice kind of like India. Isn't it India Pale Ale
Oh, yeah.
lager? Or is
Yeah,
it
yeah. Oh, hey, yeah. So word to the wise: if you want to make an IPL, buy the Redwood kit, and then buy some lager yeast, and then run.
Swap them?
Yeah, and then just do a DIY, and then say you're doing the W3470 or the Berlin or the.
So currently
Germany
we don't
yeast?
have a lager with a dry hop step, a lager yeast
That's
profile.
correct. We do not have that, but you can do it through the DIY. So you just select the lager yeast, and then you just run the Redwood, or you don't run the Redwood recipe. You run the
you put it in
DIY
the
recipe,
Redwood,
but right. That's a good one. We should really do that.
Fire us an email, Kelly, if you want to give that one a crack. Anyway, time to go home.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everybody.